NATO did not provoke or start Russia's war on Ukraine in the West. Crypto-communist Putin apologists and traitorous Russian assets in the West attempt to scapegoat NATO and America for Putin's vicious attacks on Russia's neighbors, including Ukraine. These Russian assaults on the sovereignty of Ukraine were in fact already planned out in 1997 by Putin's brain, Alexander Dugin, in Dugin's highly influential book, Foundations of Geopolitics, years before Putin came to power, and decades before Putin's aggressive invasion of Ukraine. 60 Minutes' Leslie Stahl interviewed Dugin, and he proudly owned his legacy of Eurasianist Soviet revanchism and urged Putin to act faster and accelerate Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the rest of continental Europe and the West.
You are known as Putin's Rasputin, and I've even seen Putin's brain. So he has listened to you in the past.
The base of this affirmation is precisely the correspondence between what Putin does and what I always say.
So in 1997, you wrote a book called Foundations of Geopolitics. And in it, you talked about how Russia should return to being a global superpower. Talk about that. Explain that.
I always believed, and I believe in the future greatness of Russia, because Russia was always and tried to be a superpower.
In his 1997 book, Dugin wrote that for Russia to rebuild its power globally, it would need to use disinformation, destabilization, and annexation. He said one of the targets for Russian annexation should be Ukraine.
You proposed that Russia annex Ukraine. You said that Russia should encourage Britain to leave the EU, Brexit. You suggested that Russia make Iran an ally. Now, it does sound as if Mr. Putin is following your blueprint. All of these things, right out of your book, and he's doing it.
More than that, but I have developed in my vision, Eurasian vision, that is much more, that is larger than what you have mentioned. That is only first steps in order to.
But he followed your first steps. He followed exactly the first steps.
That's take too long. So he is in the absolute position of absolute power.
Alexander Dugin wrote in his 1997 book, Foundations of Geopolitics, that Russia must aggressively seize control of Ukraine. This plan to attack and balkanize Ukraine clearly predates any of the false pretexts Putin and his paid apologists have offered for Putin's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. The problem of a sovereign Ukraine. Then there is the Ukrainian issue. Ukrainian sovereignty is such a negative phenomenon for Russian geopolitics that in principle it could easily provoke an armed conflict. Ukraine as an independent state with some kind of territorial ambitions poses a huge threat to the whole of Eurasia. And without solving the Ukrainian problem at all, it makes no sense to talk about continental geopolitics. This does not mean that Ukraine's cultural, linguistic, or economic autonomy should be limited and that it should become a purely administrative sector of the Russian centralized state, as to some extent was the case in the Tsarist Empire or the USSR. But strategically, Ukraine should be strictly a projection of Moscow to the south and west, although possible models for restructuring will be discussed in more detail in the chapter on the West. The absolute imperative of Russian geopolitics on the Black Sea coast is Moscow's total and unfettered control over its entire length from the Ukrainian to the Abkhaz territories. These sectors must be radically detached from thalassocratic influence, both coming from the West and from Turkey, or even Greece. The northern Black Sea coast should be exclusively Eurasian and centrally subordinated to Moscow. Geopolitical decomposition of Ukraine. Ukraine as a state has no geopolitical sense. It has no special cultural heritage, no geographical uniqueness, and no ethnic exclusiveness. The historical meaning of Ukraine is reflected in its very name, Ukraine, i.e., outskirts, border territories. The existence of Ukraine in its current borders and with the current status of a sovereign state is tantamount to a monstrous blow to Russia's geopolitical security, tantamount to an invasion of its territory. The continued existence of a unitary Ukraine is unacceptable. This territory should be divided into several belts, corresponding to a range of geopolitical and ethno-cultural realities. 1. Eastern Ukraine, everything east of the Dnieper from Chernihiv to the Sea of Azov, is a densely populated territory dominated by the Great Russian ethnos and the Orthodox population of Little Russia. All this territory is undoubtedly close to Russia and is connected to it culturally, historically, ethnically, and religiously. It is from this perspective that the whole geopolitical restructuring of this region is undertaken, because as the initiator of the geopolitical transformations in Eastern Europe, and as the main partner of Germany, Russia should insist, first of all, on the condition that this entire area be taken out of Atlanticist control, and that a Eurasian continental defense complex be created in this place, consisting of a military strategic cooperation between Russia and Europe as a whole. The Ukrainian problem is the main and most serious problem facing Moscow. Moscow should actively engage in the reorganization of the Ukrainian space according to the only logical and natural geopolitical model. In order to be realistic on this issue, the solution should be based not on pathetical slogans about unity of blood, brothers of the Slavs. What kind of unity this is can be seen on the example of Serbo-Carpathian massacres, but on a deep analysis of the logic of Russian-German relations, because both Ukraine and even Poland are not independent geopolitical entities, but only border regions of the two great spaces of Eurasia, Russia, and Central Europe. Ukraine, or the Empire. Russia's main long-term program is continental integration, the creation of a continental Eurasian space from Tokyo to the Azores. Moscow's task is to extend its strategic influence to the east, west, and south. The separation of the two states, Russia and Ukraine, is beneficial only to the Atlantis, the enemies of Slavicism, the enemies of our ideal. Ukrainian Putinist Igor Berkut chaired the pro-Russian party Great Ukraine and authored two pro-Putin books, Brat, meaning brother, and Brat II. Berkut advocated the Balkanization of Ukraine into several regions in a manner similar to that of Alexander Dugin's plan, but with the addition of a so-called New Jerusalem in southern Ukraine to serve as a second homeland for the Jews in the medieval lands of the Turkic Khazarian invaders who converted to Judaism in the 8th century. Vladimir Putin made clear his intention to annex Ukraine long before invading and declared that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the worst geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Putin cited the work of Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin as a pretext for Putin's desires on Ukraine, in contradiction to his false claims that NATO forced Putin's illegal invasion. So don't let anyone lie to you and deceptively claim that NATO and America are to blame for Putin's criminal attack on Ukraine. Putin and Dugin had been planning it for years before Putin surrounded Ukraine with his army and navy, lied again claiming he wouldn't invade, then did. Despite Vladimir Putin's habitual lies, he has no one to blame but himself for his disastrous invasion of Ukraine and the countless innocent lives he has taken.